The deadliest killer in war didn't carry a weapon. Most of history's great armies perished long before they ever reached the battlefield. The reason? Math. The art of keeping your soldiers from starving to death didn't even have a name until 1837. That's when Swiss General Jomini coined the term logistics, from the French word loger, meaning to quarter troops. This wasn't the science of brilliant tactics, it was the science of roads, tents, and food. Winning a battle is easy, if your army has something to eat. But Alexander the Great's campaigns were constantly crippled by a lack of grain. In a single campaign, Napoleon lost 175,000 horses simply because there was nothing to feed them. How do you feed 500,000 men in the middle of nowhere, without trucks, refrigerators, or canned food? This impossible puzzle was solved by only 3 armies in history, 3 completely different ways to survive, one of which accidentally invented your kitchen pantry. Start with the Romans. They turned feeding an army into a math problem. A legion of 5,000 men needed 20 to 30 tons of supplies every day. Every soldier carried 3 days of grain on his own back, tied to a pole called a furka, insurance against a broken supply line. His daily ration? About 830 grams of wheat, unground. Raw grain kept longer than flour, so the army pushed the labor onto the soldier. He ground it himself, by hand, after a full day's march. That soldier carried 60 to 80 pounds. Shield, armor, sword, javelins, a shovel for digging camp, and his own food. Roman writers had a nickname for this, Marius's mules, after the general Gaius Marius, whose reforms in 107 BC made every legionary haul his own gear instead of relying on a baggage train. A Roman legion marched like a self-carrying city. Every night it built a fortified camp with a ditch and rampart, even after 25 kilometers on foot. But what happened when the grain ran out? Rome had an answer: requisition. Send armed detachments into friendly or conquered territory, seize wheat and livestock from local farms, pay in coin, or don't. It worked. It also turned neutral territory hostile within weeks. Standardized rations built an empire. They also planted the rebellions Rome spent centuries crushing. Now move east, 13 centuries forward, to an army that solved this problem by carrying almost nothing at all. A rider under Genghiskhan brought up to 16 spare horses into the field. That wasn't for speed, it was food security. Marco Polo wrote that a Mongol cavalryman could ride 10 days without lighting a single fire. His rations? Dried curds of hardened milk, strips of cured meat tenderized under the saddle, and airog, fermented mare's milk. 10 pounds of dried milk powder, dissolved a handful at a time into a leather flask of water, made a full day's meal. Here's the detail that made it into every horrified footnote about the Mongols. When the food ran out completely, a rider would cut his horse's neck and drink its blood. A 13th century Armenian chronicler, held captive by the Mongols, wrote that one healthy horse, slaughtered outright, could feed 100 men for a day. Why did this work where heavier, richer empires struggled? The Mongol army carried its supply chain on 4 legs instead of in a wagon train. No convoy to defend, no roads required, no requisition turning locals into enemies overnight. The horses grazed as the army moved. When Mongol forces reached the grasslands outside Hungary in 1241, fresh pasture fattened their mounts within days, that fat turned into milk, and the milk fed the men. Grass was the entire logistics plan. Jump to 1812, to an army that believed it had finally solved this problem. Napoleon never actually said an army marches on its stomach. Historians trace that line to Frederick the Great, decades before him. But Napoleon lived the truth of it on both ends. In 1795, France's government offered a prize of 12,000 francs, roughly $150,000 today, to anyone who could invent a way to preserve food for troops on long campaigns. A Paris confectioner named Nicolas Appert spent 14 years testing methods before he found one that worked. Seal cooked food in glass jars, then boil the sealed jars until the food inside stopped spoiling. He didn't understand bacteria. Louis Pasteur wouldn't explain why the method worked for another 50 years. Appert just knew it did, and in 1809, he claimed his prize. Napoleon had funded the invention of canning. Then, in 1812, he ignored his own lesson. He marched 685,000 men into Russia, expecting a fast campaign and rich foraging. He got neither. Russian forces burned their own crops and villages as they retreated, leaving the French army nothing to seize. By the time the retreating Grand Armée reached Vilnius in November, it had shrunk to around 120,000 men. Soldiers boiled leather bootstraps for broth. Some cut open dead horses and crawled inside for warmth. The army lost 175,000 horses in that single campaign, most of them trained cavalry mounts that took years to replace. Fewer than 100,000 of the original force made it back across the border in fighting condition. The government that funded canned food watched its army die of the exact failure canning was invented to prevent. Rome solved this problem with mules and math. The Mongols solved it with grass and horses. Napoleon solved it with glass jars, then forgot his own answer somewhere on the road to Moscow. Every empire that ever conquered anything eventually hit the same wall. 20 tons of grain, needed every single day, just to keep men walking. That wall killed more soldiers than most of the enemies they ever faced.